The year was 1863, and the army had been camped in the valley for weeks, waiting for orders that did not come and for the rain to stop falling from a sky that seemed to be made of heavy gray iron. The valley was wide and flat, bordered by low hills that were covered in a mist so thick that the trees on the ridges looked like ghosts standing sentinel over the thousands of white canvas tents that stretched out in muddy rows as far as the eye could see. It was a time of waiting, a time of inactivity, when the war felt very far away and the only enemy was the boredom and the dampness that seeped into everything, into the wool uniforms and the leather boots and the very bones of the men who sat by the sputtering fires. The rain fell with a steady, monotonous rhythm, a soft drumming against the tight canvas of the tents, a sound that had become the background music of their lives, a lullaby of water and cloth that never ceased, day or night. Inside the tent, the air was thick with the smell of wet wool and stale tobacco and the faint metallic scent of gun oil from the rifles that were stacked neatly in the corner. To sit on the cot and listen to the rain was the primary occupation of the day, a task that required infinite patience and a willingness to let the mind drift away from the present moment to a place where the sun was shining and the ground was dry. The mud outside was deep and sticky, a churned-up mess of brown earth that sucked at the boots of anyone foolish enough to walk through it, so most of the men stayed inside, conserving their energy and their warmth. Cleaning the equipment was a ritual that consumed hours, a slow and methodical process of disassembly and reassembly that was performed not out of necessity, but out of a need to keep the hands busy. The brass buttons on the coat were polished until they shone like small suns in the dim light of the lantern, rubbing the cloth in small circles over and over again until the metal was warm to the touch. The leather of the belt was oiled and softened, the pungent smell of the grease filling the small space of the tent, a smell of maintenance and preparation. The rifle was wiped down with a rag, every inch of the barrel and the stock inspected for rust, although there was none because it had been cleaned yesterday and the day before that. Checking the lock and the trigger mechanism became a meditation, a focusing of the attention on the smallest details of the springs and the screws, forgetting the purpose of the weapon and seeing it only as a collection of mechanical parts that needed to be cared for. The hours stretched out long and thin, like a piece of taffy pulled until it was almost transparent. The light in the tent changed slowly from the gray of the morning to the dimmer gray of the afternoon, the shadows lengthening imperceptibly as the sun moved unseen behind the clouds. Outside the camp was quiet, save for the occasional call of a sentry or the neighing of a horse on the picket line, sounds that were muffled by the fog and the rain, making them sound distant and dreamlike. The horses stood with their heads low, their tails swishing lazily against the flies that were too cold to bite, simply waiting, like the men, for the season to turn. The smoke from the campfires hung low over the valley, trapped by the heavy air, creating a haze of blue and gray that blended with the mist. Boiling coffee was the highlight of the afternoon, a process that could not be rushed. The green beans were roasted in a skillet over the fire, carefully stirred until they turned dark and oily, releasing a rich aroma that cut through the dampness. Then they were ground in a small hand mill, the crunching of the beans a loud sound in the quiet camp. The water was fetched from the creek, which ran clear and cold over smooth stones, a journey that required navigating the mud and the wet grass. The pot was placed on the fire, and the water watched closely as it began to heat, small bubbles forming on the bottom and rising to the surface, slowly at first, and then faster, until a rolling boil was achieved. The coffee grounds were added, and the pot was moved to the side to steep, the black liquid becoming thick and strong. Drinking the coffee from a tin cup was a sensory experience, the heat warming the hands through the metal, the steam rising into the face, the bitter taste waking up the tongue. It was a small comfort, a reminder of home and civilization in the midst of the wilderness.
Letters were written and rewritten, sitting on a cracker box with a piece of paper balanced on the knee, the pen scratching softly across the surface. "Dear Mother, the rain continues, and we are still here." The words came slowly. Finding things to say when nothing was happening was difficult, so the letters became descriptions of the weather and the food and the waiting. The ink dried slowly in the humid air, requiring patience before the page could be turned. Reading old letters from home was another way to pass the time, the paper worn soft at the folds from being opened and closed so many times, the handwriting familiar and comforting. News of the harvest and the neighbors and the church socials seemed to come from another world, a world of peace and order that felt like a dream. The camp cook prepared the evening meal, a stew of salt pork and hardtack that simmered for hours in a large iron kettle hanging over the main fire. The smell of the pork and the beans wafted through the rows of tents, signaling that the day was drawing to a close. Lining up for rations was a slow shuffle, a line of blue coats moving forward, inch by inch, plates in hand, waiting for the ladle to dispense the hot food. Eating was done in silence or with low murmurs, the men sitting on logs or on their blankets, focusing on the warmth of the food and the feeling of a full stomach. The twilight deepened into night, the gray sky turning to a deep charcoal, the rain continuing its steady fall. The lanterns were lit inside the tents, casting a warm yellow glow that illuminated the canvas from within, making the camp look like a city of glowing paper houses. The sentries walked their beats, a slow, rhythmic pacing along the perimeter of the camp, their boots squelching in the mud, their eyes scanning the darkness for movement, but there was nothing to see, only the rain and the trees and the night. Standing guard was a lonely duty, a time for thinking and for listening. The sounds of the night were amplified by the darkness, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of a branch, the distant flow of the river. The mind wandered to the past, to the memories of the farm, the smell of the hay in the barn, the sound of the creek behind the house, the feel of the sun on the back while plowing the fields. These memories were kept safe like treasures, polished and examined in the quiet hours of the watch. The war was a distant rumble of thunder somewhere far to the south, a storm that had not yet reached this quiet valley. Here there was only the logistics of an army at rest, the supply wagons parked in rows, the artillery pieces covered in tarpaulins, the mules chewing their fodder. The sheer scale of the waiting was immense, thousands of men suspended in time, held in place by the mud and the orders. The game of cards played on a blanket in the tent was a slow affair, the cards soft and dog-eared, the stakes low, mere matchsticks or tobacco. The slap of the cards on the wool blanket was a soft sound, king, queen, jack, numbers and suits that had no meaning beyond the game. The conversation was sparse, long pauses between sentences, men comfortable in their shared silence. Pass the tobacco.
It's your turn. Listen to that rain. The smoke from the pipes drifted up to the peak of the tent, hanging there in a blue cloud before filtering out into the night. The fatigue of doing nothing was a heavy weight, a tiredness that settled into the muscles and the eyes. It was time to sleep, to surrender to the long night. The blankets were unrolled, rough wool that scratched the skin but provided warmth against the chill. Boots were removed, revealing socks that were damp and needed to be hung on the line strung across the top of the tent. The body sank onto the cot, the straw mattress rustling softly. The lantern was blown out, plunging the tent into darkness, a darkness that was absolute and heavy. Now the sound of the rain was the only thing left, the tapping on the canvas, close and intimate. It was a sound that enclosed the sleeper, shutting out the world, wrapping the mind in a cocoon of water and sound. The breathing of the other men in the tent became audible, a slow rhythmic chorus of inhalation and exhalation, in and out, in and out, the chest rising and falling, the heart beating slow and steady. The thoughts began to fragment, to lose their coherence, drifting like leaves on a stream. The image of the camp faded, the rows of tents, the mud, the fires, all dissolving into the gray mist of sleep. The war was forgotten, the waiting was over for a few hours. There was only the comfort of the dry blanket and the sound of the rain. The sentry outside continued his walk, step by step, measuring the boundaries of the sleeping army. The fire burned down to embers, glowing red in the darkness, a dying heat that would be revived in the morning. The horses slept standing up, their heads drooping. The birds slept in the trees. The valley slept under the blanket of clouds. It was a peace born of exhaustion and stillness, a pause in the great machinery of conflict. The night dragged on, hour by slow hour, marked only by the changing of the guard, the low voices of the sergeants, the soft clinking of equipment. Then silence again, deep, profound silence, the kind of silence that exists in the spaces between history, the moments that are not recorded in the books but are lived by the men who wait. The mind floated in this silence, untethered and free. Dreams came slow and disjointed, without plot or urgency. A dream of a white fence, a dream of a warm loaf of bread, a dream of walking on dry grass. The rain washed everything clean, washing away the boredom and the mud, leaving only the essential act of resting. To sleep was to survive, to gather strength for the marching that would surely come when the sun returned. But the sun was far away, and the rain was here and now. The dampness was a part of the atmosphere, a physical presence that could not be ignored, but could be accepted. The wool blanket felt heavy and protective, a shield against the night. The ground beneath the cot was solid and real. The world turned slowly on its axis, carrying the sleeping army through the dark towards the dawn. But dawn was hours away, a distant promise on the horizon. For now there was only the middle of the night, the deep center of the waiting. The silence was not empty, but full of the presence of thousands of sleepers, a collective unconsciousness that settled over the valley like a fog. The drummer boy slept, his drum covered in a cloth, his sticks resting by his side, his dreams filled with rhythms he did not have to play. The general slept in his larger tent, his maps rolled up on the table, his strategies put aside for the night. The private slept, his rifle by his side, his duty done. All were equal in the sleep, all were quiet, all were still. The rain slackened slightly, turning to a fine mist that coated the world in moisture, but did not drum as loudly. The change in the sound was subtle, a shifting of the gears of the night. It was a signal that the night was aging, that time was passing, even if it felt stuck. The mind registered the change and sank deeper into the pillow, seeking the layers of sleep that lay beneath the surface. It was a journey inward, away from the war, away from the mud, away from the gray sky. A journey to a place of stillness and silence, a place where there was no waiting, only being. The hours passed uncounted. The camp remained a grid of silence and shadow. The mist swirled through the tents, a ghostly visitor that touched everything with cold fingers. But the sleepers were warm, safe in their wool and their dreams. The war would wait, the orders would wait, the mud would wait. Tonight there was only sleep, and the rain, and the quiet, and the slow, steady beating of the heavy hearts of the soldiers. The darkness was a velvet curtain drawn across the stage of the world, ending the play for the day. There was no applause, only the sigh of the wind in the trees. The river flowed on, black and silent, carrying the water of the valley down to the sea. The cycle of the water, the cycle of the war, the cycle of the sleep. It all continued, endlessly, monotonously, beautifully boring. The concept of tomorrow was an abstract idea. There was only this moment, this breath, this beat. The sleep was the only reality. Deep, dreamless, restorative sleep. The kind of sleep that heals the weariness of the soul. The kind of sleep that makes the waiting bearable. The kind of sleep that is a victory in itself. And so the army slept, and the valley slept, and the night went on and on and on.
The smoke mixed with the fog, creating a haze that smelled of hickory and pine, a sharp scent that cut through the musty smell of the wet canvas. The cook was the first to be fully awake, moving with a practiced economy of motion around the mess tent, gathering the equipment for the morning meal. The large iron kettle was filled with water from the barrel, the surface of the water perfectly still until it was disturbed by the ladle, sending ripples out to the metal rim. The coffee beans were poured into the grinder again, the crunching sound, louder now in the morning silence, a rhythmic grinding that signaled the start of the day for the company. The smell of the coffee began to drift through the rows of tents, a rich and dark aroma that was the most welcoming smell in the world, promising heat and wakefulness. Men began to emerge from their tents, moving stiffly, their joints aching from the cold ground, stretching their arms and rubbing their eyes, blinking against the gray light. There was no talking yet, just the collective movement of bodies seeking warmth. They gathered around the fires, holding their hands out to the flames, watching the steam rise from their damp sleeves. The horses on the picket line began to stir, shifting their weight from leg to leg, their hooves making wet, sucking sounds in the mud. Their breath came out in great white clouds of steam, puffing rhythmically into the cold air. The feed bags were brought out, the sound of the corn rustling in the canvas sacks, causing ears to twitch and heads to turn. The chewing of the horses was a steady, crunching sound, a texture of noise that was comforting and domestic. Bacon was sliced into thick slabs, the knife cutting through the preserved meat with a dull slide. The grease hissed and popped as it hit the hot skillet, spitting small droplets of oil into the fire, causing the flames to flare up briefly. The smell of the cooking meat mixed with the coffee and the smoke, creating a dense olfactory tapestry that hung heavy in the damp valley. Hardtack biscuits were brought out, hard squares of flour and water that had to be soaked in the coffee or fried in the grease to be edible. The men sat on logs or cracker boxes, balancing their tin plates on their knees, eating slowly and deliberately, savoring the warmth of the food. The metal spoons scraped against the metal plates, a quiet clinking that was the music of the breakfast hour. There was no rush to finish, no hurry to be anywhere, because the orders still had not come, and the mud was still too deep for marching. The fog showed no sign of lifting, clinging to the ground with a stubborn persistence, wrapping the camp in a cocoon of white. To look down the row of tents was to see them fade away into the mist, the farthest ones looking like vague triangular shadows. The sun was a pale disk, trying to push through the clouds, a weak circle of light that offered no heat. After the meal, the dishes had to be cleaned, a process of scrubbing them with sand from the creek bank to remove the grease, and then rinsing them in the cold, flowing water. The water numbed the fingers, turning them red and clumsy, making the task take longer than it should. The tin cups were hung back on the belts or placed in the haversacks, clinking softly as they settled. The fire was fed more wood, the logs settling into the ash with a soft crumbling sound. Pipes were filled with tobacco and lit, the smoke drifting up to join the fog. The conversation was low and sporadic, centered on the weather and the rumors of movement that drifted down from headquarters, rumors that were as insubstantial as the mist. Maybe we move today. Maybe the rain comes back. Maybe the supply wagons get through. No one knew, and no one really expected to know. It was enough to just sit by the fire and be dry and warm. The morning stretched out before them, a long expanse of gray hours that had to be filled.
Some men went back to their tents to sleep some more, taking advantage of the lull. Others sat and whittled pieces of wood, shaving long, thin curls of pine that fell to the mud at their feet, a pile of white shavings growing slowly with each pass of the knife. The knife blade was dull and the wood was damp, but the motion was soothing, a repetitive action that required no thought. Whittle, slice, turn, whittle, slice, turn. A small wooden chain began to take shape from a single block of wood, a useless object of beauty born from boredom. A harmonica was played softly in the distance, a mournful tune that drifted through the fog, the notes bending and wavering in the humid air. It was a slow song, a ballad of home and lost love that fit the mood of the morning perfectly. The notes hung in the air long after they were played, fading away into the silence. The camp was a city of waiting, a suspension of life between the battles. The uniforms were stained with mud and sweat, the blue wool turning a dark brownish color that blended with the earth. Buttons were missing, knees were patched, brims of caps were torn. It was an army of ragged men who had learned the art of stillness. The fog began to lift slightly, revealing the tops of the hills, which were green and lush, a sharp contrast to the brown mud of the valley. A hawk circled high above, riding the thermals, looking down at the strange collection of white shapes on the ground. To the hawk, the army was just a feature of the landscape, like a rock or a river. To the men, the hawk was a symbol of freedom, a creature that could fly away from the mud and the waiting. But they could not fly, so they sat and watched the fire. The logs burned down to coals, glowing with a deep, intense red heat that pulsed with the wind. A log would snap occasionally, sending a shower of sparks swirling up into the smoke. The sparks rose and faded, dying out before they reached the height of the tents. It was a microcosm of their lives, a brief flare of activity, followed by a return to the ash. The morning moved imperceptibly towards noon, the light growing slightly stronger but never breaking through the clouds. The air remained heavy and damp, pressing against the skin. The wool uniforms felt itchy and heavy, a burden to wear. Boots were taken off to let feet dry, the leather stiff and caked with mud. Socks were inspected for holes and darned with needle and thread, the needle weaving in and out of the fabric in a slow rhythm, in and out, over and under, mending the wear and tear of the march. It was a domestic task performed by rough hands, a necessity of survival. The needle was small and silver, flashing in the gray light. The thread was coarse and strong. The repair was functional, not pretty, a scar on the fabric. The quiet of the camp was deep and abiding. It was not a silence of emptiness, but a silence of paused activity, like a clock that had stopped ticking but was still wound. The potential for noise and violence was there, buried deep under the mud and the boredom, but for now it was dormant, sleeping, waiting. The men were statues of patience, carved from patience and wool. They sat, they smoked, they stared. The river flowed on, the fog drifted, the fire burned, the world turned, and the waiting continued. The sun had climbed to its highest point in the sky, although its position was only a guess based on the slight brightening of the clouds that blanketed the valley, a diffusion of light that cast no distinct shadows, but rather bathed the entire camp in a flat and featureless illumination that made the afternoon feel exactly like the morning, only longer and heavier. The midday meal had been eaten, a repetition of the breakfast, with the addition of some boiled beans that had been soaked overnight, and the men had settled into the deep lethargy of the afternoon, a time when the body is fed, but the mind is starved for stimulation. It was the hour of the letter writers, the time when the camp turned inward, and the thoughts of the soldiers traveled the long miles back to the farms and the towns they had left behind. In the quiet of the tents, the small portable writing desks were brought out, wooden boxes with hinged lids that held the precious supplies of communication. The paper was often scarce and of poor quality, thick and rough to the touch, with a tendency to absorb the ink too quickly, making the letters look fuzzy and indistinct. But it was all they had, so it was handled with care and reverence. A soldier sat on an upturned hardtack crate, his back hunched over the small surface of the desk, his posture one of intense concentration. He uncorked the inkwell, a small glass bottle that had traveled in his knapsack for hundreds of miles, the cork making a small squeak as it was twisted and pulled free, releasing the sharp chemical smell of the black liquid, a scent that was strangely civilized in the midst of the mud and the canvas.
The pen was a simple steel nib holder, the wood stained with the sweat of his fingers and the ink of previous letters. He dipped the pen into the well, the metal tip disappearing into the blackness, and then tapped it gently against the glass rim to remove the excess, a ritual that was performed with the precision of a surgeon. The tip of the pen touched the paper with a scratchy sound, a friction of metal on fiber that was audible in the silence of the tent. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The sound was rhythmic and slow, a dry whispering of words coming into existence. "Dearest Martha," he wrote, the letters forming slowly in a loop of cursive that he had learned in a schoolhouse far away, a schoolhouse that seemed like a dream now. The ink flowed from the nib, shining wet and glossy for a moment, before soaking into the fibers of the paper, turning a dull matte black as it dried. He paused, staring at the white wall of the tent, searching for the words to describe a life where nothing happened. "It has rained for 3 days," he wrote. "The mud is deep. We have plenty to eat. I am well." The sentences were short and simple, stripped of all ornamentation, just as his life had been stripped of all luxury. There was no need to write about the boredom, because she would not understand the depth of it, the weight of it, so he wrote about the weather. The pen dipped again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. He described the fog, how it lay on the hills like a blanket, how it dampened the blankets and the coats. He described the coffee, how it was hot and strong. He asked about the harvest, about the corn and the wheat, about the horse in the barn. Writing these questions made the home feel closer, made the memory of the barn smell real in his nose, replacing the smell of the damp wool. Other men in the tent were doing the same, sitting on their cots with pencils and scraps of paper, biting the ends of the wood, staring into space. The tent was filled with the soft sounds of composition, the rustle of paper, the scratching of nibs, the heavy sighs of men struggling to articulate their waiting. A fly buzzed around the inkwell, attracted by the smell, or perhaps the moisture, landing on the rim and rubbing its legs together. The soldier watched the fly, his eyes following its tiny movements, a distraction that was welcome. The fly flew away, and he returned to his letter. The ink on the page was a map of his thoughts, a physical record of his existence in this place. When the page was full, he waved it gently in the air to speed the drying process, the paper making a soft flapping sound. He folded it carefully, creasing the edges with his thumbnail, making the lines sharp and straight. The envelope was small and delicate compared to the rough hands that held it. He addressed it slowly, ensuring every letter was legible, knowing that this piece of paper had to travel by wagon and train and horse to reach the hand that would open it. Sealing the envelope required a dab of wax or a bit of flour paste, a final act of closure. He placed the letter in his pocket, patting it to make sure it was safe, a physical connection to the world outside. The afternoon wore on, slow and immutable. Outside the tent, the camp life continued its slow cycle. A wagon creaked past on the muddy road, the wheels grinding through the deep ruts, the mules snorting with effort, the driver flicking his reins with a lazy wrist. The sound of the wagon faded into the distance, leaving the silence to return. Some men had given up on writing and were playing cards again, the deck worn and soft, the edges fraying. They played solitaire mostly, a game for one, perfectly suited to the isolation of the crowd. The slap of the card on the blanket, the shuffle, the cut, the deal. It was a hypnotic rhythm, a way to occupy the hands while the mind slept. Others were mending their gear again, finding loose threads that needed tightening, buttons that needed securing. A soldier sat polishing his belt buckle with a piece of old rag, rubbing the brass until he could see his own distorted reflection in the gold surface. Rub, rub, rub. The repetition was soothing, a circular motion that had no beginning and no end. The smell of the brass polish was acrid and strong, cutting through the smell of the mud. He looked at his reflection, a gray ghost in the metal, and then went back to rubbing. The air in the tent was growing stuffy, a combination of body heat and damp wool, so someone tied back the flaps to let in the breeze. The breeze was cool and wet, carrying the smell of the river and the wet earth. It fluttered the edges of the canvas, making a snapping sound, snap, 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 that was irregular and startling in the quiet. Through the open flap, the view was of the next row of tents, an identical vista of white canvas and mud. There was no variety in the view, no change in the scenery. It was a hall of mirrors made of cloth. A dog wandered through the camp, a stray mongrel with matted fur and sad eyes, looking for scraps of food. It sniffed at the tent pole, hesitated, and then moved on, its paws making no sound on the soft ground. The soldier watched the dog go, feeling a kinship with the wandering animal. We are all just wandering here, he thought, waiting for a bone or an order. The light began to shift again, losing its brightness, turning a deeper shade of slate gray as the afternoon drifted towards evening. The time between noon and sunset felt like a week, a vast ocean of time that had to be crossed without a boat. Sleeping was a common way to cross it. Men lay on their cots, wrapped in their blankets, hats pulled over their eyes, dozing in the twilight of the tent. Their breathing was a low rumble, a collective snoring that vibrated in the air. To be asleep was to be away, to be free from the mud. The soldier with the writing desk put away his pen, cleaning the nib carefully with a scrap of cloth, corking the inkwell tight. He closed the wooden box, the latch clicking shut with a finality that marked the end of his task. He placed the box under his cot, pushing it into the straw. Now he had nothing to do. He sat on the crate and looked at his hands. They were dirty, the fingernails rimmed with black soil, the skin rough and calloused. He picked at a callus on his thumb, peeling away a strip of dead skin, feeling nothing. He looked at his boots. They were covered in mud again, despite the cleaning of the morning. It was a losing battle against the earth. He leaned back against the tent pole, feeling the wood press into his spine, a solid line of support. He closed his eyes and listened. He heard the distant murmur of voices from the next regiment, a low hum like a hive of bees. He heard the clanking of a pot in the cook tent. He heard the wind in the trees on the ridge. These sounds were the texture of his life now, the soundtrack of the war. He thought about the letter in his pocket. He imagined it traveling. He imagined the mail wagon, the train, the post office. He imagined his mother walking to the mailbox at the end of the lane. He played the scene over and over in his mind, a movie that never ended. The envelope opening, the reading, the smile. It was a way to be there without leaving here. The dampness of the ground seeped up through the crate, making his legs cold. He stood up and stretched, his joints popping. He walked to the tent opening and looked out. The sky was darkening, the clouds lowering. It looked like rain again. Of course it did. It always looked like rain. He watched a group of soldiers gathered around a fire, a few tents down. They were boiling water, probably for tea or coffee. He watched the steam rise. He watched them pass a cup around. It was a slow tableau of camaraderie.
He decided to join them. He walked through the mud, his boots squelching. He nodded to the men. They nodded back. "Room on the log?" he asked. They shifted, making a space. He sat. The heat of the fire felt good on his face. Someone handed him a cup. It was hot tea, weak and sugary. He took a sip. It tasted of metal and sugar. "Nice," he said. They grunted agreement. They sat in silence, watching the fire. The flames licked at the wood, turning it black, then gray, then white ash. It was a consumption of fuel, a release of energy. The soldier watched a piece of bark curl and burn. He watched a spark fly up. He watched the smoke drift into the eyes of the man across from him, causing him to blink and rub his face. "Sorry," the man said. The wind shifted. The smoke moved away. They sat. They drank tea. They waited. The afternoon dissolved into the early evening, the transition unmarked by any event, just a gradual darkening, a gradual cooling. The bugle sounded in the distance, the call for retreat, the end of the official day. The notes were clear and brassy, floating over the valley, echoing off the hills. It was a beautiful sound, a sad sound. It meant that another day was done, another day of waiting, another day of surviving. The men stood up, stretching, kicking.
He nodded to the men. They nodded back. "Room on the log?" he asked. They shifted, making a space. He sat down. The heat of the fire felt good on his face. Someone handed him a cup. It was hot tea, weak and sugary. He took a sip. It tasted of metal and sugar. "Nice," he said. They grunted agreement. They sat in silence, watching the fire. The flames licked at the wood, turning it black, then gray, then white ash. It was a consumption of fuel, a release of energy. The soldier watched a piece of bark curl and burn. He watched a spark fly up. He watched the smoke drift into the eyes of the man across from him, causing him to blink and rub his face. "Sorry," the man said. The wind shifted. The smoke moved away. They sat. They drank tea. They waited. The afternoon dissolved into the early evening, the transition unmarked by any event, just a gradual darkening, a gradual cooling. The bugle sounded in the distance, the call for retreat, the end of the official day. The notes were clear and brassy, floating over the valley, echoing off the hills. It was a beautiful sound, a sad sound. It meant that another day was done, another day of waiting, another day of surviving. The men stood up, stretching, kicking the fire together. "Time for chow," someone said. They moved off towards the mess tent, their blue coats merging with the gathering shadows. The soldier walked back to his tent to get his plate. The letter was still in his pocket, a warm weight against his hip. He felt it there and smiled. He had done something today. He had written a letter. He had bridged the gap. He entered the tent, which was dark now. He fumbled for his matchbox. He struck a match, the flare blinding him for a second. He lit the candle. The small flame illuminated the canvas walls. He saw his cot, his blanket, his kit. It was all there, just as he had left it. He picked up his tin plate and spoon. He blew out the candle. He walked out into the night. The rain began to fall again, a soft drizzle that wet his face. He didn't mind. It was just water. It was just the weather. He walked towards the smell of the food, towards the light of the cook fire, towards the next hour of waiting. And the war slept on. The guns were silent. The mud was deep. And the night was long. The last echoes of the retreat bugle had long since faded into the damp air, leaving behind a silence that was heavy and absolute, a silence that seemed to press down on the valley like a physical weight. The sentry stood at the edge of the perimeter, his boots sinking slightly into the soft earth, his blue wool coat buttoned all the way to the chin against the chill of the rising mist. It was the second watch, the time when the camp was most deeply asleep, when the fires had burned down to mere beds of glowing coals that looked like red eyes staring out from the darkness. He shifted the weight of the musket from one shoulder to the other, a movement that was slow and practiced,
the leather strap creaking softly in the quiet. The metal of the barrel was cold and wet with dew, a moisture that gathered on everything in this valley, coating the world in a slick sheen. He began his pace, a slow, measured walk along the invisible line that separated the sleeping army from the empty night. 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps. The sound of his boots on the wet grass was a soft swish, 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 a rhythmic whisper that marked his progress. He walked to the old oak tree that marked the end of his beat, and then he turned slowly and walked back. 10 paces, 20 paces. There was nothing to see in the darkness, only the vague shapes of the bushes and the trees, which looked like hunched figures standing in the mist. The fireflies had come out, rising from the tall grass in the meadow below, thousands of tiny sparks of yellow and green light that blinked on and off in a silent, chaotic rhythm. Blink, wait, blink. They drifted on the air currents, floating up and down, moving without purpose, simply existing in the night. The river lay beyond the meadow, a dark ribbon of water that moved ceaselessly towards the sea. The sound of the water was a low, continuous murmur, a gurgling sound as it flowed over the smooth stones and the fallen logs. It was the only constant sound in the night, a background noise that filled the ears and smoothed out the thoughts. The sentry stopped to listen, his head tilted slightly to the side, letting the sound of the river wash over him. It sounded like voices murmuring in the distance, or like the wind in the trees, but it was just water moving over rock. Gravity and water, a simple, eternal process. The mist was thicker down by the river, a white band of fog that hugged the banks and obscured the water from view. It looked like a river of clouds flowing through the river of water. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves, a smell of the autumn woods. The sentry took a deep breath, holding the cool air in his lungs for a moment before exhaling a long, slow cloud of steam that vanished into the night. He resumed his pacing. Left foot, right foot, left foot. The rhythm was hypnotic. He was not thinking of the war or the enemy or the marching. He was only thinking of the step, the placement of the boot, the balance of the body, the weight of the gun. It was a meditation in motion. The darkness was not empty. It was full of texture. The rough bark of the trees, the soft wetness of the grass, the sharp cold of the metal. The sky above was a deep charcoal gray, the clouds breaking apart slightly to reveal a few faint stars that flickered weakly in the haze. They were far away and cold, looking down on the valley with a detached indifference. The sentry looked up at them, tracing the patterns of the constellations that he knew, the Unter, the Bear, the Wagon. They were the same stars that shone over his home far away. Seeing them made him feel a strange connection, a thread of light that tied him to the past. But the past was distant, and the night was present. A twig snapped somewhere in the woods, a sharp crack that sounded like a pistol shot. The sentry froze, his hand tightening on the stock of his rifle, his eyes straining into the dark. He listened. There was a rustle of leaves, a pause, then the sound of a small animal scampering away, a raccoon or a possum moving through the undergrowth. He relaxed, letting the tension drain out of his shoulders. Just a critter, just the nightlife of the woods. He shifted his weight again and continued his walk, back and forth, a pendulum of flesh and wool. The boredom was a heavy cloak that wrapped around him, making his eyelids heavy, making his thoughts slow. It would be so easy to sit down, to lean against the tree, to close the eyes, but he could not. He was the eyes of the army. He was the watcher in the night. So he walked. He counted his steps. 100, 101, 102. He counted the fireflies. He counted the beats of his heart. The night stretched out interminably, a long, dark tunnel of time.
The mist swirled around his legs, dampening his trousers, making the wool cling to his skin. He felt a drop of water fall from the brim of his cap and land on his nose, cold and startling. He wiped it away with the back of his hand. The condensation was heavy tonight. The world was sweating. The silence was deep enough to drown in. It was a silence that amplified the small sounds, the beating of a moth's wings against the tree bark, the shifting of the gravel underfoot. The sentry felt alone in the universe, a solitary figure standing on the edge of the world. But he knew that behind him were thousands of men sleeping in rows, breathing in unison, dreaming of peace. He was guarding their dreams. He was the wall between the sleep and the danger. This thought gave him a small measure of purpose, a reason to keep walking. The river continued its song, a lullaby that never ended. Rush, gurgle, flow. It was the sound of time passing, the sound of the earth breathing. The sentry stopped again and leaned on his rifle, resting his chin on his hands, which were folded over the muzzle. The metal was cold against his cheek. He watched the mist rise and fall. He watched the fireflies dance. He watched the shadows lengthen and shorten as the moon moved behind the clouds. It was a slow-motion movie of the night, a film with no plot and no actors, only the scenery and the atmosphere. He closed his eyes for a second, just a second, to rest them from the strain of peering into the dark. The darkness behind his eyelids was warm and red. He felt a wave of dizziness, a gentle swaying sensation. He snapped his eyes open, shaking his head. Stay awake. Keep walking. He moved his feet, stomping them softly to get the blood flowing. He rubbed his arms. He took another deep breath. The night air was his fuel. The silence was his companion. The waiting was his job. And so he waited. He waited for the dawn. He waited for the relief guard. He waited for the end of the watch. But mostly he just waited, existing in the moment. A sentry in the mist, a soldier in the dark, a man in the quiet middle of a sleeping war. The moon finally broke through the clouds, a gibbous moon that cast a pale silver light over the landscape, turning the mist into a glowing sea of white. The light revealed the details of the meadow, the tall stalks of the grass bowing under the weight of the dew, the spiderwebs strung between the bushes, glistening like necklaces of diamond. It was a scene of stark beauty, a black and white photograph of a peaceful world. The sentry watched the moonlight reflect off the surface of the river, creating a path of shimmering light that danced on the water. It looked like a road to another world, a road that led away from the mud and the tents. He imagined walking on that road, stepping lightly on the water, leaving everything behind. But he was rooted to the earth by his boots and his duty. An owl hooted in the distance, a mournful sound that echoed through the valley. Hoo, hoo, hoo. The sound was lonely and sad, fitting for the empty night. The sentry checked his pocket watch, pulling it out by the chain and angling it towards the moonlight. The hands pointed to 3 o'clock, the deepest part of the night, the hour of the wolf. He had been on duty for 3 hours. 1 more hour to go. 1 more hour of walking. 1 more hour of silence. He put the watch back, the metal case clicking shut. He felt a pang of hunger, a hollow feeling in his stomach. He thought about the hardtack in his haversack, but decided to wait. Eating would be a distraction. He needed to stay sharp. He needed to stay bored. Boredom was safe. Excitement was dangerous. He resumed his pacing. The ground was getting muddier as the dew settled, turning the dirt into a slick paste. He had to be careful where he stepped, placing his feet deliberately to avoid slipping. Slide, step, slide, step. The rhythm changed, becoming more cautious. He watched the tree line. Was that a shadow moving? No, just a branch swaying in the breeze. The wind had picked up slightly, a gentle breath that rustled the leaves. Rustle, hush, rustle, hush. The trees were whispering secrets to each other, secrets that he could not understand. He felt like an intruder in the natural world, a foreign object in the landscape of the night. The animals belonged here. The trees belonged here. The river belonged here. He was just a visitor, a temporary inconvenience. The thought made him feel humble. He was small. The night was big. The war was big. But he was just one man, walking in the dark. He reached the end of his beat again and turned. The camp lay before him, a city of ghosts. The white tents glowed faintly in the moonlight. He could see the faint orange glow of the dying fires. He could smell the smoke. It was a sleeping giant, a beast that was resting before the hunt. He felt a surge of protectiveness. These were his brothers, his family. They were depending on him. He straightened his back. He gripped his rifle tighter. He walked with a little more purpose. The night was long, but he was strong. He could wait. He could walk. He could watch. The river flowed on, indifferent to his thoughts. The fireflies blinked, indifferent to his presence. The moon shone, indifferent to his gaze. The world was indifferent, but he was not. He cared. He watched. He waited. And the night continued its slow-turning wheel, moving towards the dawn that was still just a dream in the east. The path from the perimeter led back towards the center of the camp, where the large hospital tent stood apart from the others, a massive structure of white canvas that glowed faintly from within, like a paper lantern set down in the mud. The air inside the tent was distinct and separate from the cool mist of the valley, a heavy and warm atmosphere that smelled of camphor and iodine and the sweet, cloying scent of chloroform mixed with the damp wool of the blankets and the pine sawdust scattered on the floor to absorb the dampness. It was a smell of containment, a smell of quiet care that enveloped the senses immediately upon entering the flap. The tent was long and high, the ceiling lost in the shadows above the reach of the lanterns that hung from the center posts, swaying gently in the drafts that managed to sneak in from the outside world. Rows of cots lined both sides of the tent, stretching down into the dim distance, each one occupied by a sleeping figure, a soldier wrapped tight in gray or brown blankets, only the pale blur of a face in the gloom. The silence here was different from the silence of the woods. It was a human silence, a collective hush of 50 men breathing in a shallow, feverish rhythm that created a soft background noise, like the ocean far away, or the wind in dry grass. The sentry sat at a small wooden table near the entrance, her head bowed over a pile of linen bandages that needed rolling. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her hands finding a rhythm that was hypnotic to watch. She took a long strip of white cloth, smoothed it out on the table with the palm of her hand, feeling the rough texture of the weave, and then began to roll it tight, starting at one end and tucking the fabric in with her thumbs. Roll and tuck, roll and tuck. The motion was repetitive and endless, a task that required no thought, only the muscle memory of the fingers.
The roll grew larger, a perfect white cylinder of clean cotton that would soon be stored in the wooden chest. She worked in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of the fabric and the creaking of her chair when she shifted her weight. The light from the lantern on the table cast a warm yellow circle on her work, illuminating her hands and the white cloth, while leaving the rest of the tent in a respectful twilight. She finished one roll and placed it in a neat stack, then reached for another strip, smoothing it out again. Smooth, roll, tuck. The pile of finished bandages grew slowly, a tower of white in the dim light. She paused for a moment to trim the wick of the lantern, using a small pair of metal scissors. The snip sound sharp and distinct. The flame flared briefly and then settled back into a steady teardrop shape, burning clean and bright. She looked down the rows of cots, checking for any movement, but there was none, only the stillness of the sleepers. The shadows of the tent poles stretched long and thin across the floor, dancing slightly as the canvas walls breathed in and out with the wind. It was a hypnotic movement, a slow expansion and contraction of the room itself. The nurse stood up, smoothing her apron,
her dress making a soft swishing sound as she moved. She picked up a pitcher of water and a small basin, moving quietly down the central aisle between the rows of beds. Her shoes were soft-soled, making no sound on the sawdust. She stopped at the bedside of a young soldier who was tossing slightly in his sleep, his forehead sheen with sweat. She dipped a cloth into the cool water, wringing it out until it was just damp, the water dripping back into the basin with a soft plip-plip-plip sound. She placed the cloth on his brow, the coolness seeming to calm him instantly. He sighed, a long exhale of relief, and settled back into the pillow, his breathing deepening. She stood there for a moment, watching him, ensuring he was at rest. The act of watching was a form of medicine, a silent vigil that offered comfort in the dark. She moved to the next cot, where a man was mumbling in a low delirium, words that made no sense, fragments of memories from home. She adjusted his blanket, pulling it up to his chin, tucking the edges in around his shoulders, cocooning him in warmth. He quieted down, the mumbling fading into a soft snore. The nurse continued her rounds, a ghost in white, moving through the valley of the shadow. She checked the medicine bottles on the small table at the far end of the tent, rows of glass bottles in amber and blue and clear glass, catching the faint light. She picked one up, checking the level of the liquid inside, the brown fluid sloshing heavily against the glass. Laudanum, a sleep inducer, a painkiller. She placed it back down, the glass clinking softly against the wood. She checked the jar of salve, the tin of pills, the box of lint. Everything was in order. Everything was waiting. The order and the cleanliness were a defense against the chaos of the war outside. Here, in this tent, there were rules and routines. There was a time for waking and a time for sleeping, and now was the time for sleeping. The nurse returned to her table and sat down again. She picked up a book, a small volume of poetry bound in worn leather. She opened it to a marked page, but she didn't read. She just looked at the words, letting them blur into shapes on the page. Her eyes were tired, the lids heavy. The atmosphere of the tent was soporific, the heat and the smell and the rhythmic breathing acting like a lullaby. She rested her head on her hand, her elbow on the table. The lantern hissed softly, burning the oil drop by drop. The shadows on the wall seemed to slow down their dance, becoming languid and heavy. A moth fluttered around the glass chimney of the lantern, tapping against the hot surface. Tap, tap, tap. It was a tiny sound, but in the silence it seemed loud. The nurse watched the moth, her eyes following its erratic flight. It was searching for the light, just as they were all searching for the dawn. But the dawn was still hours away. The night was a long tunnel that had to be traveled inch by inch. The breathing of the soldiers was a collective pulse, a living engine that kept the tent warm. Inhale, exhale, pause. Inhale, exhale, pause. It was a rhythm that synced with the nurse's own heart. She felt a deep sense of peace, a feeling that for this moment everyone was safe. The war could not reach them here. The mud could not reach them here. They were suspended in a bubble of canvas and care. She closed her eyes for a second, listening to the tent. She heard the wind brushing against the roof. She heard the distant call of an owl. She heard the settling of the wood stove in the corner, which gave off a gentle, radiant heat. The stove was a black iron box, a sturdy companion in the night. The fire inside was banked low, glowing through the grate like a sleepy eye. The nurse opened her eyes and reached for the water pitcher, pouring herself a small cup. The water was tepid but wet, soothing her dry throat. She drank slowly, holding the cup with both hands. She looked at her hands, red and chapped from the washing and the work. They were strong hands, capable hands, hands that brought sleep. She put the cup down and picked up the bandages again. There were always more bandages to roll. It was a task that never ended, a cycle of preparation. She found comfort in the infinity of it. Roll and tuck, roll and tuck. The white cotton unspooled like a ribbon of time. The soldier in the corner coughed a dry, hacking sound that broke the rhythm, but he didn't wake up. The cough subsided, and the silence filled like water in the tent. The nurse looked at the pocket watch that hung from a pin on her apron. It was ticking softly, a mechanical heartbeat against her chest. 4 o'clock, the deepest valley of the night, the time when the spirit is most tethered to the body, the time when the world stops turning for a moment to catch its breath. She felt the weight of the hour pressing down on her shoulders. She shifted in her chair, trying to find a more comfortable position. The wood was hard, the back straight. It was a chair meant for work, not for rest, but she rested anyway, letting her mind drift. She thought of her garden back home, the rows of herbs and flowers, the smell of the damp earth in the spring. She thought of the mint and the thyme and the lavender. The smell of the medicine in the tent shifted into the smell of the garden, a phantom scent that brought a smile to her face. She was walking in the garden, touching the leaves, feeling the sun. It was a waking dream, a lucid moment of escape. The reality of the tent faded slightly, the canvas walls becoming transparent, the cots turning into garden beds. Then the moth tapped against the glass again, snapping her back. She was here, in the hospital, in the war. But it was okay. It was quiet. It was safe. She looked at the rows of sleepers again. They looked like children now, their faces smoothed with sleep, the lines of worry and pain erased by the darkness. They were just men, tired and worn out, needing rest. She was the guardian of their rest. She was the keeper of the silence.